Welcome. In this video, we'll be looking at the Unit 6 DBQ and the scoring guide and giving you some advice about your revision process. The first thing we need to do, of course, is analyze the prompt. There's this background information about how in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European nations colonized Africa in a process known as a scramble for Africa. And remember this part that says develop an argument is really where we're focusing. So it says evaluate the extent to which the various African responses to the European scramble for Africa were different. So we're always looking for those magic words like this difference. So I know that I am going to be writing a comparison essay. And when I see that, the question I ask myself is, what am I comparing? So I look at the prompt at this part right here that says African responses to the European scramble for Africa. And that's what we refer to as those key words. And that's really important because when I analyze the documents, it tells me what to look for. So here are the documents down here. And remember, we're looking for African responses. So there should be a voice in my head when I'm looking at a document. This is document 1. And the voice is asking, what is the African response? And this column right here for the answer is designed to collect those key words. So I'm asking myself every time I read a document, what response am I finding here? And I like to underline stuff. So it says this is a form signed by multiple rulers. And it says here we pledge ourselves not to enter into a war with other tribes. So I wrote a note here that it's peaceful and multiple rulers have signed a treaty. Now a note about this document that gave people trouble in the essay itself is that a lot of people wrote this from the perspective of the Royal Niger Company, which is essentially the British government. So if we write the Royal Niger Company had a treaty signed by African rulers, that's not an African response, that's a British response. So we need to make sure, as we have here, that we're focusing on what the African rulers did, which in this case is signing the treaty. We're going to look at each document really quickly, and the scoring guide focuses on the source stuff over here, so we're just going to focus on the answer. Here in this number 2 document from an Ashanti leader responding to a British offer of protectorate status, it says there's a suggestion that we should enjoy the protection. He says we will not commit ourselves to a policy. We must remain at the same time friendly with all white men. So I called this peaceful again. Resisting protection offer wants to be on good terms with all European states and not take sides. So we have 2 peaceful responses so far. Document 3 is the Emperor of Ethiopia in a letter to several European powers, in which he says, I have no intention of being indifferent spectator if the powers divide up Africa. Remember, what they're responding to is that scramble for Africa. And it goes on to say that we can't recover our seacoast by force. He says up here that we've lost a lot of territory to Muslim powers. We are hoping that the Christian powers, with the help of our Savior Jesus Christ, he's reminding them that the Ethiopians are Christian also, will restore the territory to us. So they're hoping to get it back. So what I have over here is my answer, or the African response. It's peaceful with Europeans, but they're actually trying to regain territory from Muslims. In a sense, they're participating in the scramble themselves. It's not Europeans taking land from Africans, it's Africans taking land lost to Muslim powers. So I've got 3 peaceful documents so far. In document 4, we had a leader of the Herero people in a letter to another African leader. And he says a lot of things. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he says, let us die fighting rather than as a result of all these things. Tell the chiefs to rise up. So I put, now we have fighting back. And so I could be a bit more specific. I said they're resisting German occupation. Remember, I don't want to say the same thing over and over again. So if I am going to have a paragraph about fighting, I don't want to say, in document 4 they fought, in document 5 they fought, in document 6 they fought. I might say something like resist German occupation, so I can be a bit more document specific. We're on document 5 now. It's that image of the battle between, as it says here, Ethiopian and Italian troops, and it shows fighting, so I put they fought back. In this case, they're fighting against the Italians. And for evidence, I can just describe what I see in the picture. I can talk about the guns, the people who are dead, the cannons pointing at each other to prove that they fought. Document 6, we have the Ashanti Queen Mother, and she says, some of you, she's making a speech to chiefs, some of you are afraid to fight. If the men of Ashanti will not go forward, then the women will. We will fight the white men. We will fight until the last of us falls on the battlefield. So we have fighting again. And to be more document specific, I have that the men have let them down, and so it's women who are carrying on the fight. I could do some interesting point of view stuff here with the fact that she's the queen mother or an elder woman in this tribe. For our last document, document 7, this is an African veteran of a war against the British advance in South Africa. He mentions a rebellion, and he says they fought us with their guns. Many of our people were killed in the fight. It does point out that the white men or the British had superior weapons, but for our purposes, in terms of it being an African response, it's another example of them fighting back. In this case, it's a rebellion against the British. And in my evidence, I can characterize this fight as one-sided if I need to. But remember, I am collecting those responses, and that's the most important step for analyzing these documents in terms of organizing the essay and creating an argument that's going to work. So if you remember, that prompt was a comparison, and so now that we've collected a bunch of responses, I can sort of think about a basic chart like this. And remember, we're going to be more specific when we actually answer the prompts, but documents 1, 2, and 3 all showed peaceful responses, and 4, 5, 6, and 7 all showed fighting back. And so I can use that as my two-part argument. So in my thesis, just make a note here, I'm going to sort of have a comparison that said they were different. Some people responded by fighting, and some people responded peacefully, or some version of that. Let's look at what that looks like. Here's a sentence frame for the thesis I can use. It's got the dates and the place from the prompt, and it says they responded to European imperialism, including the scramble for Africa, in different ways. Some states responded through blank because, remember I need a reason, blank, and other states responded blank because blank. So remember we talked about those two main responses, peaceful and fighting. And here is a sample thesis that does that, and it's highlighted by success criteria. So here's my same basic, parts from the frame. And then here is my comparison. Some states responded through violent resistance and calls for warfare against European invasion. Because, and I asked myself, why did they do that? They wanted to maintain their political and economic independence. Others responded with diplomacy, which is a different way of saying peacefully, in order to keep the peace and prevent more bloodshed. So when we use that success criteria, this is a T3 and this is a T4, and then this is a T3 and this is a T4. So that's a complete thesis that works, and it sets up those two paragraphs and would kind of fit with that chart that I had. And in this case, it doesn't really matter what order we go in. We're going to back up now and look at context. Remember, in our context, we want to have specific historical details that are relevant to the context of the prompt. We want a brief explanation and not put the evidence from the document. So I'm going to ask myself, okay, what would be context? And if I think about, all of world history, and if I think about imperialism, which is what this is about, we have dates in the prompt. It was about 1880s to 1910 or so. So if I want to think of a timeline, remember, this is where the documents are happening. So my body of my evidence, my body paragraphs, will be in this slice of the timeline, and over here would be my context. So I need to think about what happened back before the 1880s that is relevant, that kind of sets the stage for understanding this relationship of imperialism. And something that I would hope would occur to us would be industrialization. And some of you, the most successful context writers, remembered an activity we did in class that looked like this, that you could use to help you with this contextualization analysis. So here's imperialism over here. And so the stuff that we had put in this column would be kind of from the essay. And so some people went back a step and they went over here and they thought about the fact that industrialization happened in Europe. And we wrote a note in here in our chart that it created a demand for resources to try to expand business, that there was an economic element of Europeans trying to make money and expand their business. So that is the purpose of context, is to say, essentially, you need to understand the basics of industrialization in order to understand imperialism. Another way to think about it is this process of imperialism might not have happened without this need of Europeans caused by industrialization. So if we come back over here to the scoring guide to see what that could look like, here are some examples listed that I could use. So the fact that they needed new materials and resources because of industrialization. Here's the idea of new colonies and new markets. I could talk about this political element of competition between European nations. And it would be good to end with a little details about the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa, since that's what the thesis is about. So now I'll pop down here and look at the sample context, and I can see my background. It says European countries sought cheap labor, raw materials, and new labor markets to further their own industrialization and profits. I put some examples. Asian countries like China, India, Vietnam, and Cambodia experienced imperialism from European countries. I will go over to Africa, that they competed and they diplomatically divided territories up to control them in the Berlin Conference. So that's all my details. That's C1 in the success criteria. And then I have my transition. African leaders were not invited to the negotiating table. They claimed it was their right. And as they continued to invade, they had many different responses. And again, that's my C2, and that's setting up my thesis, which I put right here. So I don't want to give the answer yet. That belongs in the thesis. So remember, you're going back a step in the sort of chain of events in history and thinking about things that happened before the topic of our essay that are relevant to understanding the essay. So that's a run through of the scoring guide in terms of analyzing the prompt, looking at the documents, and creating an argument and writing an intro paragraph. I'm not going to go over every document, but I will go over document 4 as an example of sort of the pros and cons, or the do's and don'ts of writing these evidence sentences. So here's that violent resistance paragraph, and it's got documents 4, 5, 6, and 7 in it. We have to remember the success criteria. We need some kind of a lead-in and some kind of a citation, but the most important thing is an answer to the prompt that is proved with evidence. And remember, when we were gathering all that information, here was our document and we were writing stuff down here, that we were looking for an African response. So that is what my answer should be. So every one of these documents should contain a statement of how Africans responded specific to that document. So I've got 3 no's here, and then I've got a yes. So we'll look at common problems that we saw. For example, in document 4, Mahihiro states, quote, "Tell all the chiefs down there to rise and do battle." There's no answer. So this answer needs to come from you. You are the historian, and you're saying, here is how the Africans responded. And then we need to paraphrase the evidence. So just directly quoting doesn't work. This example right here doesn't get any credit whatsoever for using the document. Go on down to my second example here. I've got the same elements, but I've changed my quote to a paraphrase. In document 4, Mahihiro states, I guess it should not have that African leaders should band together in order to take up arms to fight off the Germans. It's paraphrased, but I'm still missing the answer. So that one has a possibility of 1 point for evidence if I do that for all the documents. Here I have one that's an attempt at an answer. He wants to resist European influence. But we have a note here that is too vague. We need to try to be specific to the document. So this one might get also the 1 point. These are 2 like partial evidence sentences. And here's my better example. So my answer, see how it's yellow here, suggests joint African armed resistance against European powers. So joint is one thing that's specific to this document, due to their inhumane cruelty towards his people, when he writes that African leadership band together and take up arms. This one is better, and that would get full credit. And if we do that for every document, we can get 2 evidence points. So go back when you're revising and make sure that you have a statement of a response that is specific to the document, and check these examples. I'll just show you really quickly. We didn't do that for every single document. So for the other documents, we just said, here's basically what your TE2 answer should say. And here's an example of what that evidence could look like, and here's a sample. But we didn't do the no, 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 yes for every single one. To go back to the source analysis, we are doing 2 things. We're identifying the information we're picking, and then we're using it to explain the evidence. And this is the trickiest part. And one thing that we've added from the last one is that this is a good place actually to talk about the purpose. And I would actually advise that we don't select purpose here, but we talk about purpose down here. We'll see that in a minute. This is pretty clearly, I think, a bad example. Samuel Mahihiro is an African leader, so he wants to help his people. We just need more. I read that and I say, so what? What does this have to do about your evidence? What does this have to do about the events that happened? Let's be more specific here. So this is me pointing out the point of view. He's an African leader. So here's my S2. So he uses his position of power to appeal to another leader to appeal to his sense of pride in Africanism and hopes he will join the fight and help him defeat the Germans. And if you notice, this really goes along well with this up here, where I'm saying African leaders should band together and rise up in order to fight off the Germans. So that's what we're doing, and notice that this is purpose analysis. So I think the way to do this would be to pick from the three left, point of view, audience, or situation, point it out, and then ask yourself why. Why does that explain the evidence? And in so doing, you're going to be using and talking about the purpose. And I like to use the word so. He's an African leader, so he uses his position of power, and make sure that's specific. I might have a so here, but it's really not in enough detail. So just to show you, for every document, we said 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's bullets of what should be in there with a sample for 5. Same thing for 6. Same thing for 7. There's an example of outside evidence you could use that kind of matches the documents and where it would fit in your paragraph. And then we go on and we have the same thing for the other paragraph about trying to keep peace and being diplomatic for 1, for 2, and for 3. So it's really important in your process for becoming better at writing DBQs that you really engage in this process of revising, that you use these scoring guides, that you go back and forth between what you did and what we have here in the scoring guide, and that you thoughtfully fix your work, and that's how you're going to get better. So we hope that's helpful and look forward to seeing your revised essays.